Thank you all for coming out tonight for the 25th Annual Wilderness Lecture Series. In many ways, I think this talk probably should have been our first talk of the session. Tonight, Harvey Locke is going to be presenting a grand vision for why we need and how we can achieve landscape conservation on a large scale from Yellowstone, thousands of miles up north to the Yukon. So Harvey was one of the founders of the Waidawai Conservation Initiative, and he's offered a vision towards which many of us can focus our efforts. And the vision isn't just about protecting land, it's about encouraging how people can be a part of a healthy landscape. His ideas have resonated both near and far. As we heard last week, the proposed Transboundary Peace Park proposal is just one element of this larger Waidawai initiative. And Harvey has been involved with this project and many other projects. He's also been involved nationally and internationally, speaking about this sort of mental geography across the world. So last fall, he was in South Africa at the World's Park Conference. He's spoken with the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, and to many, many, many audiences across the United States and up into Canada. And in many ways, Harvey is helping to connect the ideas of landscape conservation that we're working on here to areas throughout the world. So the lessons we learn here can be applied elsewhere, and the lessons we learn elsewhere can be applied here. He's been a leader in looking at what inspires successful conservation initiatives and seeing how local politics interface with national policies and understanding how human dynamics affect decision-making and in watching the spread of creative ideas and initiatives across the landscape. Having grown up in Calgary and now living in Eastern Canada in Toronto, Harvey brings an understanding that's both rooted in this region and also which has perspective from the outside. His professional loyalties, though, remain here. He's a board member of the Waidawai Conservation Initiative. He's also a board member of the Nature Conservancy of Montana and the vice president of conservation for Canada Parks and Wilderness Society. And as indicative of his capacity to inspire and motivate, Harvey was named one of Canada's leaders for the 21st century by Time Magazine Canada. So we're really pleased to have you here. And also I should announce that we're very pleased to have co-sponsored this event both with the Waidawai Conservation Initiative and also the Environmental Studies Department here at the university. So without further ado, let's welcome Harvey here. Thank you.
I think after that, I should just shut up and sit down. It won't get any better than that for me. Thank you, Nikki. That was really nice. Before I begin the formal part of my talk, I just want to say everything that I talk about was not divinely revealed to me, but comes from a zillion sources and a zillion people, and there's a lot of people who are responsible for these ideas, how they play out across the landscape, who have contributed to this idea of Yellowstone to Yukon. It's built on conservation biology. So I want to be really clear that this is a huge collective endeavor in the Yellowstone to Yukon context. There are hundreds of groups and dozens of individuals and scientists, all of whom are trying to make this work. So I will give a narrative talk, but I want to be really clear that it's like all things, no one ever does anything by him or herself. And this is not going to happen without the whole bunch of people being engaged, and a whole bunch of people are engaged. So with that sort of opening comment, and also a word of thanks to you guys for having me here. It's really great. I'm very flattered to be here at the University of Montana. I had a good friend who went to school here 30 years ago, and I remember when this town had a place called the Park Hotel. And it was pretty rough then, actually. So Missoula has become quite civilized in the last 30 years. It's quite remarkable. To us delicate Canadians coming down to the wild American West here. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to have the lights dimmed, and I'll start my talk. Okay, that's great. Oh, I guess we need to turn the projector on. Could you just flick that on, Seth? Thanks. Great. I want to talk to you about wild places. Wild animals, people, and the power of a vision. This is the vision that settled North America. This is a painting from the 19th century I showed this at the last talk I gave to some Forest Service people, and I was going through it, and one of the guys said, "I hope you're at the right lecture." And I said, "Isn't this a lecture on modern American attitudes towards pornography?" But he said, no. Anyway, this is a painting called American Progress, as we Canadians say it, or Progress as you'd say it. And this is Liberty. And she is the spirit of the 19th century. She embodies progress. She's coming westward from the big cities in the east. With her comes the telegraph line. You can see her stringing it in her hand. She's carrying the Holy Bible. Behind her come the trains and the plow and the settlers. And before her flee native people and wild animals. And this was the mental geography that my family followed in the 19th century when it came up the Missouri by steamer, when there were still buffalo herds in the way and they had to stop, and then they went and settled southern Alberta and broke the sod. And except in Canada, you'd have to fatten her up, put a crabby expression on her face, and it'd be Queen Victoria. But it was exactly the same mental geography. This was progress. This is what we should do in the 19th century. But there was another thing at work in the 19th century, and that was the Romantic movement. And the Romantic movement also had an impact on people's mental geography. This is Yellowstone, of course, and when that progress came west and people encountered this level of visual magnificence and this kind of a place that has an impact on the human spirit, they said perhaps progress consists in also leaving some places alone. And the result was that the national park idea was born. Yellowstone is the world's first, Banff in Canada was the world's second. And so these ideas come from here and this place. And by the beginning of the 20th century, we had developed a sort of consensus about how to conserve landscapes and nature. We would have our progress over all of the landscape, but we'd also create green boxes on the landscape that we would label as things like wilderness areas, which were remote areas that we would protect, or national parks, which would be a little bit less remote but protected. This is Canadian, so provincial, territorial, state parks. Wildlife management areas where there's more intensive management to target one species, or something like the National Bison Refuge just north of here. And then managed forests, which would be a national forest in the areas outside of the wilderness areas, or crown forests up in Canada. And we believed that we could save nature by doing this. We would have our progress and have our conservation too. And it's been 100 years since that paradigm was in place. And we now can test how well that works. This is a graphic from Boston. This is the city of Boston here, and this is Middlesex Fells Reservation. Middlesex Fells was made into a protected area in the 1890s. When it was created, it was out in the country. And what they found is that plants like this, a bulb-reproducing species like the wood lily, had disappeared. And in fact, there were now 200 native plants and about 70 exotics. And the ones that had disappeared because the place had become encircled, or an island, you can see how the city grew around it, were the species that reproduce through burrs, like through animal transport, or bulbs. If people dug up the bulbs, they couldn't get back. They had no way to get there. But pollen-bearing species were fine because they still had connections to other sources of pollen. And the exotics, of course, were invading. So we can see there that a strict protected area wasn't able to hold on to its ecological integrity over the course of 100 years, as much by encirclement as about anything. What about these guys, big things like grizzly bears? This is a photograph from my friend John Weaver. How does the protected area system at a bigger scale work for things like them? This is a map of the big protected areas in North America. There's the Adirondacks in the east. Middlesex Fells doesn't show up. There's Yellowstone. Here's the big 4 million acre block here in this, just over the west of here in the Salmon-Selway country. There's Bob Marshall Glacier. There's Banff. There's Jasper. Here's a big whopper wood buffalo. This is Nahanni up in the Northwest Territories. How do these protected areas work? Are they big enough to hang on to nature? Well, this is a map of the distribution of grizzly bears historically. 1850, Lewis and Clark, or 1812, Lewis and Clark came across. They're in Great Falls. There's grizzly bears at Great Falls. There are grizzly bears all over the Great Plains. There are grizzly bears in northern Mexico. California state flag has grizzly bears on it. Where grizzly bears remain today, however, is only dark red. And in between, you have this 1922 data that somebody collected that showed that there were all these island populations of grizzly bears scattered around the mountains of the western United States. And every one of them has disappeared, except for the island in Yellowstone. And that island has survived because it's still big enough to hang on for now. But you can see the range contraction, and every one of these populations disappeared or winked out. In California, you can go into a museum in San Francisco and see the last bear in California. He's in a glass case. And you can see him on the state flag. But this is a 20th century phenomenon. This is the same thing that's at work at Middlesex Fells. Too small to maintain the species. Here, the population densities of these animals are low. If something bad happens here, like a fire or a disease or poaching or something like that, they just don't recover because it's isolated, and they disappear. And you can see that the Yellowstone Island is there. You can see that big block in the Salmon Sellway. They dropped out of there even though that's the biggest roadless area in the lower 48. And you can see they're just coming down a peninsula of life, down the Bob Marshall Glacier from Banff up here, and up to the bigger gene pool in northern British Columbia, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Alaska. So you can see a pattern here. And we're very concerned that the Yellowstone population might disappear if it's not reconnected back up to this reservoir of life up above. We've also learned things from the modern advent of radio telemetry, satellite collars, and so on. This is Pluie, a wolf who was radio collared by the researchers up in the Kananaskis area. And she, in her adult life, traveled 11,000 square kilometers. We did not understand that wolves moved at that scale before. She was radio collared up in here. In the course of her life, here's where we are. There's Montana, there's Alberta, BC, Washington, so on. This is an inset map of that. Pluie is radio collared up in here, and she did something like this 3 times in her life. Now, we used to say Banff National Park protects wildlife as follows. And what it really is, we know in Banff National Park there's only one wolf pack that actually will stay inside the park. They used the whole system. And when Diane Boyd did her study of wolves recolonizing the United States down here in the Flathead, and Paul Paquette was leading a study up here in the Peter Lloyd Park, they had an amazing discovery. They were finding each other's wolves when they were doing their research. And they said, where are they? Ooh, see, gee. That's what they were doing routinely, moving between there and there, from Glacier up basically to Banff. One of the wolves Diane radio collared went from here all the way down to Yellowstone. Another went from here all the way up to mile 0 of the Alaska Highway, which would be about there. And the DNA of these animals is all the same. And we didn't know that before, that this is the system at which nature works. And we discovered in the 1990s what the fellow who discovered this, a guy named Peter Sherrington, called a 19th century naturalist discovery. He was out birding one day in the Kananaskis just west of Calgary, in an area where we have records that show people have been around for 12,000 years. But nobody noticed that there was an eagle migration. And he accidentally had his binoculars on the wrong setting when he was trying to lift them up to look at a bird in the sky, and he spotted way high above the mountains this motion, so he refocused. And he found that there was this bunch of golden eagles going off over the mountains. He said, what's going on here? And so he watched for a few hours, and he saw like dozens of them. And then we came back, and it was going on. And he discovered there's a migration of 5,000 plus golden eagles plus other raptors that go up the Rockies every spring and down the Rockies every fall. Now there's a Golden Eagle Festival in Canmore with spotting scopes on the school roof where you can see the eagles go by. We didn't know this before. Where do the eagles go? Well, this is some stuff that the U.S. project in conjunction with the U.S. Army out of Idaho did. That's the summer and winter range of the golden eagles. Idaho up the Canadian Rockies, into the Yukon and on into Alaska, summer and winter. So we're discovering that nature works at a very large scale and that this system is actually that big, not the size of Yellowstone, not the size of Glacier. I gave this talk about 6-7 years ago to the Greater Yellowstone Coalition's 125th anniversary party for Yellowstone, and some trumpeter swan researchers came up to me and said, you can add some trumpeter swans to your list. We banded some babies up here in Nahanni, and they wintered in Yellowstone. Well, they didn't call them babies, but I did. Goslings, I guess. So a bunch of us got together and created this idea of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And the idea is that we have a lot of these big green areas to work with, and if we could just link them together and create some new ones where there aren't any up in the north, we might just hang on to nature at the scale she operates at. And we can do that while working with human communities to keep prosperous and happy people in the landscape, and to find a way to meet that great challenge of human coexistence with nature. And that's fundamentally what we're about, trying to maintain a big corridor in the mountains for nature to continue to flourish along with humans. It's built on this conservation biology model pioneered by Reed Noss, which built on the old former biosphere reserve idea that predated that. The idea you have core protected areas like Yellowstone or the Selway Bitterroot or Glacier or Banff, connected to each other by corridors across the landscape to other secure breeding core areas and so on up the landscape, and that you have lesser degrees of intensity on the land use around them, ultimately to high intensity uses. The corridor concept does not mean a human exclusion zone or a sidewalk. It means a landscape through which things can move and not die in such numbers that they can't get to the other side or they can't interact with other species so that you keep genetic connectivity. So think of it as a permeable landscape as opposed to a rigid set of lines on a map that exclude people altogether. An early application of this thinking that predates the Yellowstone to Yukon idea was the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which was a legislative effort to sort of bring some of this thinking to bear. There are a lot of other things going on at the same time. But we started to think at this larger scale. And one of the fun things is this was a map generated here in Missoula. We had to actually do an atlas of the region because you couldn't actually, at the first meeting we had, there was no map that I could find that had Yellowstone and the Yukon on the same map. We actually had to commission them, other than an atlas of all of North America or photograph, because we didn't have that in our mental geography. So we did this atlas. This is a very cool map of linear disturbance density. That's a fancy way of saying how many roads per square kilometer, or rail lines, or something that chops a landscape up. And this is an interesting way to look at this world. Here, green means no roads, no linear disturbances. And that area there, if you want to compare it, that's about half as big as Montana. So certainly as big as western Montana. Big chunk of wild country. But you can see, though, these hot colors, these hot pink colors. That's where the road density is highest, and it goes way up here. That's oil and gas roads along the eastern slope of Alberta, where 95% of the gas from that is imported to the United States comes from. You can see, though, the big green blobs are pretty strong up here, and then the colors break up as you come south, and you start to see islands emerge. There's the Selway Bitterroot or Salmon Selway Island system. There's the Yellowstone Island. Here's the Bob Marshall Glacier Island. And even though that's still a peninsula that connects, you can see the colors are changing up to Banff. And you can see the isolation occurring just from the state of the landscape. So our objective is to make sure that that doesn't fracture into islands and reconnect all that. I'm going to take you on a bit of a visual tour of this landscape to give you a sense of what it's like. First place I'm going to take you is down to Grand Teton. National Park, there to protect wildlife. There are pronghorn antelope in Grand Teton Park if you go there in the summer. The pronghorn are there, but they can't winter there. They've tried and they die. They are down here. There's Grand Teton, but they need to winter down here in the upper Wind River. This is the pronghorn on the move in May near Pinedale, Wyoming. This is a migration that, according to Joel Berger, is, I think, the third longest ungulate migration in the world. What the antelope do there. The caribou and the wildebeest do more. And this is ancient. We know from Aboriginal campsites and so on that this has gone on for a long time. And that movement needs to occur through a very tight pinch point between Pinedale and Grand Teton National Park, up the Gros Ventre River there. We just need to keep that corridor open if we want to keep that migration open and if we want to keep pronghorn antelope in Grand Teton Park. It's that simple. So there's an application at the far end of the Yellowstone to Yukon system. This is a map of the Rocky Mountains. Now I know that some of you think you're sitting in the northern Rocky Mountains, and I'm here to tell you that you're not, really. This is a map done from satellite data by a guy named Eckhard Zeidler, who was living in Germany, though he's a Canadian. And he painted this from satellite data, and it's deadly accurate. And it begins just north of here. This is the bottom end of the Rocky Mountain Freight Trench around Ravalli, or someplace just north of here. And it goes all the way up to the Yukon border. And what you can see is that the northern Rockies, actually, there's the Canada-US border. They go a long way north. Many degrees of latitude north of here. And this is the Rocky Mountain Trench, which is a feature very close to where we are now, begins here and runs north for almost 12 degrees of latitude. It's one of the great valley systems in the world. This is a view of it from the air above the Columbia River wetlands in British Columbia. It starts down in Montana, and you can see that line going right off to the edge of the horizon. And one of the things it shows you is that the basic structure of this landscape is north-south. It's not east-west. So here you see these deep valleys. If you're an animal trying to move through that system, you're going to move this way. You're not going to try to go across like that. You're going to go up and wait to the intersection of the valleys and so on. And that's the case for the Rockies. In fact, if you go to the bottom of the Mission Range here in Jocko River country, geologically that's actually the bottom end of the Canadian Rockies. That's what a geologist will tell you it is. And they run way north for 12 degrees of latitude from here. I'm going to take you up to the North Country, and since I bet this audience is a bit outdoorsy, I'm going to give you some eye candy from a really wild place and a really special area we're working on. This is Nahanni National Park. You'll remember all this area is big chunks of green, but in terms of linear disturbance density, but it's undesignated, it's unprotected, it's just wild country. Over here in Alaska, there's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Everybody's heard of that. This is Avavik National Park, which is what we've done on the other side of the border. And the caribou actually go from here to there. That's what the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge herd does. It doesn't just hang out here. And the sort of Yellowstone to Yukon vision sort of abuts the bottom end of where the caribou come in the summertime. I'm going to take you into the Northwest Territories. This is the Mackenzie Mountain Range, which is one of the great wild ranges left on the planet. Truly wild place. Takes you hours to fly over some of it. This is Nahanni. Nahanni, this is a national park that's about 1,500 square miles, so a bit bigger than Glacier, that was created to prevent a hydroelectric dam from taking over this waterfall in the 1970s. It's one of the few parks that actually doesn't protect the high country, it just protects the low country. And I'm going to show it to you a little bit. This is a Canadian wilderness icon that, interestingly, is not well known here. It has the plateaus similar to the plateaus in the Southwest. This is a big karst feature, one of the big karst features in the world. In addition to this, there are 4 incised canyons that are entrenched meanders if you've done geology, so like the San Juan River Canyon if you've been down there. There are also great batholiths. This is the Mount Harrison Smith, or the cathedral from Glacier Lake. That's 5,000 feet of granite. And this is a place, are there any climbers in the room? Couple. Anybody ever heard of the Cirque of the Unclimbables? This is where the Cirque of the Unclimbable is in the Nahanni watershed. I'm going to take you there with this image. That's how big that granite is. That's a helicopter. For scale, I was walking up. And this is up in the Cirque of the Unclimbables, and if you're a climber, you've heard of the Lotus Flower Tower, which is this granite climb here. This is a pretty spectacular place. We are working on making this national park 7 times bigger. It's 1,500 square miles now. It would end up being 35,000 square kilometers if we succeed, or 9.5 million acres, so 3 or 4 Yellowstones. And this is not a fantasy. This can happen. This is an image from the river. I was talking about the canyons and how spectacular it is. This is in what they call Second Canyon. The canyons are numbered in reverse order from the falls down. And this is a place where, as a canoeist, you would think the river's naturally going to go around the bend. This place is called the Gate of the Nahanni. I'm going to show you what happens just up ahead of these canoeists. It breaks through the wall. And I want you to keep an eye on this. This is called Pulpit Rock. I'll give you an idea of scale here. That's a raft. And that's Pulpit Rock there. So this is a really, really cool place. We're working with the Decho First Nation. This is Herb Norwegian, the Grand Chief of the Decho First Nation, working through a brochure about how we want to expand the park by 7 times. That's the park superintendent on the right. And Canada has adopted an action plan to expand its national park system. In the last year, the former Prime Minister Chrétien announced a plan to create 10 new national parks, expand 3 existing parks, and create 5 marine conservation areas in order to protect 100,000 square kilometers of wilderness. So that was a very happy day for me. I enjoyed that day a lot. And one of his great moments, he said, "I love wilderness, Canadians love nature, we're going to do this thing." So it feels good to have a friendly administration occasionally. So this is what that looks like in terms of us creating a great big core area in the north. This is the current Nahanni boundary. And the red line is the entire watershed that we're trying to protect. And we can do this. It's in the action plan to expand. We're just not sure how big we'll get. Our goal is to get an entire intact watershed. So picture the entire Yellowstone River protected to where it joins the Missouri. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. One of the things, that I showed Herb Norwegian there, he's a Dene person. And one of the things that we've done is a lot of connection with First Nations or Native Americans. And, we talk about these discoveries, and we've learned these things about science, and the First Nations people or the Native Americans say, oh, gee, I'm glad you finally caught on. We've known that this is the scale that this landscape works at for a long time. In fact, if you look at the archaeology, this is how people came into the Americas, was down the front range of the Canadian Rockies into this part of the world. And in the Dene language, this is called the Denetana, the People's Trail. If you go over the divide and talk to what you call Blackfeet, we call them Blackfoot, they call this the Old North Trail. That's part of their cultural memory. They immediately understand that that's the landscape, and they're just glad we've caught up. I want to spend a second talking about conservation theory. This is a university after all. And top down and bottom up. This is a slide that Reid Nosk let me use. Top down gives you the big picture, which is some of the big habitat fragmentation maps, for example. Context, priorities, networks, information, and sometimes money to help you do conservation. Bottom up gives you local knowledge and respects values like democracy, autonomy, freedom, and it shows that you're caring as a conservationist. It's my hypothesis that you absolutely need both all the time. It's become very fashionable to say that this is everything, and this speaker will tell you I don't believe it. It is not true. This is not everything. This is important, but it's not sufficient. We also need the good old top-down stuff. If there were no National Parks Act and no Endangered Species Act, there would be no grizzly bears in the lower 48. Thank you very much. That's just a fact. Because of those statutes and because of the work people do pursuant to them, the grizzly bear is recovering. There would be no wolves in the United States, lower 48, but for those statutes. So I'm going to use this mix of top-down, bottom-up to come. I showed you that big chunk of wildness there. That's the fun part. I'm going to come into the more challenging part where conservation's difficult given the fragmentation. And I'm going to focus the rest of my talk right down in this part of the world here. First place I'm going to stop is in Banff National Park. Banff sits in the Bow Valley. Bow Valley is one of the few east-west breaks that runs across the Rockies. There's only like a half a dozen of them. One's the Crow's Nest Pass, one's the Bow Valley and Banff, one's the Peace River, and so on. And the Clark Fork also runs across the Rockies here, you might notice. It's an anomalous east-west break. In the Bow Valley, we have highways and railways and people, which we always do in low elevation valley bottoms. This is a view from on high. This is Trans-Canada Highway, which is busier than I-90. In terms of traffic, this is the Canadian Pacific Main Line, which is the busiest rail line in Canada. This is a busy place, and there's also human communities here. It's also still got all the carnivores that are native to the area living in the valley. Grizzly bears, wolves, cougar, wolverine, you name it. So what's been done is the road was fenced, and wildlife overpasses have been put over the highway. And these were done explicitly to deal first with roadkill, and the first mitigations were small culverts like they have used for cattle to get them under the highway. Those were not successful for carnivores. There was an eschewing of those by carnivores, especially at the beginning. They worked really well for elk, especially elk that weren't hunted. So part of talking about it at a big scale about why this matters, if your only issue is roadkill and local wildlife stuff, a fence along there that keeps animals off the road is good enough. If you're thinking about this as a key link in a north-south flow of life, where if we walled off Banff Park and cut it in half, the United States would become isolated from the distribution of carnivores point of view at a North American scale. It becomes a very different issue. And that's the big picture context stuff. And by articulating this as an issue, and we were having a fight about whether the government would spend more money on it, and I referred to this as the Berlin Wall of biodiversity, the fence. It became a really big issue in Canada, and the government came up with $3.5 million to build 2 of these. And these were ideas that came from Europe, and there were researchers who were saying, look, we've got to do better. And so do these things work? Well, these are 50 meters wide, or 50 yards wide. And they were located at places where the park wardens thought they might work because there was a lot of roadkills. Now this is what they look like on top. This is standing on top of one of those overpasses. This is a photograph I took in May. This fellow here named Tony Clevenger has been in charge of the research project. This guy goes out every day and measures animal tracks. This day there were grizzly bear tracks on top of this overpass. It's been used by cougar, it's been used by black bear, it's been used by moose, it's been used by pine martens. It's thousands of passes through the various mitigations in Banff Park, where actually the most extensive highway mitigations for wildlife in the world apparently are found. It is not perfect. There's Tony and others who are of the view that if the highway continues to be twinned and you get deeper into heavy carnivore habitat, the overpasses should be twice as wide. But in case you don't believe me, that's a grizzly bear going over the overpass. So we can actually do stuff. We don't have to just say that the world's falling apart around us. We can actually make progress. This is an underpass that works also. The day I took this photograph, you can see the size of it for scale. Those are people at the far end. There were wolf and grizzly bear tracks under there the day I took this photograph, as well as elk and others. And no, the carnivores don't sit on the edge and wait for the animals to come through. Everybody asked me that question. It has not happened. And it might be because this highway here has got 8 million people a year drive along it. It's not a particularly nice place to be if you're a reclusive animal, which is what carnivores are. I'm going to come back to this. So I was just talking about highway mitigations here that are designed to prevent the lower half of here from becoming a big fat island. I want to take you down this peninsula. This is a grizzly bear distribution peninsula, into this box here, which is part of where the Yellowstone to Yukon vision really, the rubber really has to hit the road. This is the Highway 3 area of the Crow's Nest Pass of Alberta and British Columbia. And Chris Servine, who I'm pleased is here tonight, has described this as extremely important for the survival of large carnivores in the United States. And why would that be? Well, because if you cut that off, you create an island here, and you can see the patterns. So here we've been focusing in on this area quite intensely. And I'm going to take you on a little tour of it and talk about the efforts we've been making to bring this to ground. This is the Canada-US border. And we have a difference in management. This is Glacier National Park. This is the Flathead Valley in British Columbia. Here, a grizzly bear is a protected species. There, it is open season. It's a hunted animal. A wolf is a threatened, endangered species here and protected. Here, it's vermin. So this is a bit of a dysfunction, one might say, from a wildlife management point of view. And part of it is perspective. To the United States, this is the top of the funnel of life. To a Canadian, it's the bottom. So if we're not thinking collectively about how this matters, you know, what would matter to us if that animal's disappeared from there? We got all that other stuff up there. But if we take a shared perspective of the landscape, it's a really big deal. John Weaver did a study on to try to help address this issue on the Transboundary Flathead as an international river. You call this the North Fork. We just call it the Flathead because we haven't got the middle and the South Fork. But this is the North Fork of the Flathead drainage. And John did a study bringing together for the first time all the data from Canada and all the data from the US on how animals use the system. So we've identified this 100,000 acres, and I think you had a talk last week, for some of you were here, on the expansion of Waterton Glacier Park. This is an area we identified as needing to add to Glacier. You see how it's a missing piece now that would be added to Waterton, and we would round out the Peace Park, protect the headwaters of some streams that drain into Glacier. And this is part of the action plan that the Prime Minister of Canada announced a couple of years ago. Is to one of the park expansions is to expand Waterton. And this comes out of thinking at scale and thinking across the border. In terms of top-down, bottom-up, well, this is a happy week for me. This was about a year ago. The New York Science Times featured John's study and talked about it as America's wildest valley, the Flathead, and the Canadian side and so on. And this was a forum we had in Fernie where local support for Flathead Park expansion registered, where there was a sense that perhaps local people didn't want this, but in fact, as we advanced this issue, talked about in context, we had a lot of local people get very interested in this. This is the town of Fernie in British Columbia, which is surrounded, and there are grizzly bears and cougars and lynx and so on that use this landscape all around the town of Fernie. Fernie's a settled community, been there 100 years, has a ski hill. Some of you probably know it. The people there are excited about, many people, they're not all, but many people there are excited about coexistence and building their community around this nature connection. One of the other issues about this part of the world is that's the Flathead, and this is really high quality grizzly bear habitat in green. But you can see this highway breaking across it. I talked about the highway up in Banff, And all along this highway is private land. So we can get the 95% of the land that's public land and figure out for ways for animals to survive. But what about these communities and getting people meeting their needs and also getting animals across the road? One of the things you look at what's there. There's a highway, there's a railway, and there's people. Very repetitive pattern. You can think of that in Missoula. Exactly the same circumstances, except Missoula's bigger. Fernie's a popular ski hill. We've got subdivisions spreading out into areas that were previously wild places. So what we've done is, this is some work initially done through using a model that Chris developed that World Wildlife Fund Canada did, and it's been supplemented by some field work by a variety of people. There are 6 corridors, basically, that are still useful for carnivores like grizzly bears remaining across Highway 3 in that box I showed you. And this is the threads. These 6 are the threads that hold the connection between the existing flow of carnivores down in the States and not. And we've developed a strategy to try to protect all those blocks of private lands. We've already basically missed out on this one because of some stuff that's filled it in. But in these areas, we've been moving forward on that because of this broader context. And I'm pleased to tell you that the Nature Conservancy in Canada and Tembec have agreed on protecting the riparian areas all along here and here, conservation easements here, and a moratorium on subdivision on 90,000 acres of Tembec's land there for wildlife corridor connectivity purposes. And we're just in the last stages of raising the money to put that to bed. And it's something that feels really good because it's happening at the right scale in the right places. And to give you an idea of the kind of stuff we're going to protect, this is the Flathead, this is the Elk River Valley. Including in this forest here just around the bend are the oldest cottonwoods ever found in the world. And this is the Morrissey Creek that feeds up over into the North Fork of the Flathead. So we can do this stuff. What about here? This is a little picture I took of the campus that we're on here last fall. And what about this part of the world where things have been broken a little bit? Can we fix them? Can we put them back together? Or is that impossible? Or are we talking about ancient memories? Not at all. This is one of the most interesting places from an ecological point of view in the Rocky Mountains. This is the Salmon Selway, or the Selway Bitterroot, whatever you want to call it. It's just west and south of here. 8 million acres, if you include the roadless lands, that are roadless. Biggest block of wild habitat in the States. Unfortunately, the carnivores, a lot of them have dropped out of it. The grizzly bears aren't there. The wolves were reintroduced recently. But the modeling that's been done by World Wildlife Fund and many others shows that this is perhaps the richest area for those species in the whole system. And I wanted to read you a little thing about, I got a book in Bozeman on the weekend. It was written by Ernest Thompson Seton, and it's called The Biography of a Grizzly. Now, some of you might know who Ernest Thompson Seton is, and Pat Williams told me today that there's an area called the Thompson Seton up near the North Fork of the Flathead, which is named for this guy. This is the book, The Biography of a Grizzly, if you can see it. This was written in 1902. Thompson Seton is, before Thompson Seton, large animals were called big game. After Thompson Seton, they were called wildlife. Some historians say he invented the word wildlife. And he was a Canadian like me, but he was very active here in the United States. And this is a story he wrote. He invented literature from the perspective of the animal. That was one of his contributions. And this is the story of Wob, a grizzly bear who was born near where those pronghorn were migrating in the Little Piney, up in the top of the Wind River, just south of Yellowstone. A book he wrote 100 years ago. And he's talked about Wob's life, and then he talked about another bear that came into Wob's life. And the bear was from this part of the world, from right in here. And they called those bears roachbacks then. I'm not sure why. Pat was speculating that it might be because that's what happens when their hair stands on their end. They look like that. But I'm going to read this to you because this is a pretty interesting thing from a book in 1902. He was not a big bear, or he would not have been crowded out. Biologists would call that demographic pressure. He would not have been crowded out. But he had been trained in a good school, so that he was cunning enough to get on very well elsewhere. How he wandered, I'm going to take you on this. He wandered, let's see if I can make this work here. He was in here. How he wandered down to the Salmon River Mountains and did not like them. how he traveled until he got among the barbed wire fence of the Snake River Plains. Let's see if I can find it, sorry. And found there, and of course could not stay there, how a mere chance turned him from going eastward to the park, where he might have rested, how he made for the Snake River Mountains and found more hunters than berries, how he crossed into the Tetons and looked down with disgust on the teeming man colony of Jackson's Hole, does not belong in this history of Wab. But when Baldy Roachback crossed the Gros Ventre Range and went over the Wind River Divide into the Greybull, he does come into the story, just as he did into the country and the life of the Meeteetse grizzly who lived here. So that was the movement of that bear according to Ernest Thompson Seton 100 years ago. A dispersing juvenile male, as a biologist might call that. So a number of scientists have modeled how that story might occur again. And right now there's the Yellowstone Island. This is World Wildlife Fund study that we helped fund through Yellowstone to Yukon, talking about where animals could live in current and future sources and where they're absent and so on. And in the Yellowstone, there's a big productive block of current and future source habitat for animals to spill out into the landscape, just like the roachback did. And when you model it, there are none in here now, but this comes out as spectacular grizzly bear habitat. The Selway Bitterroot west of here. And they didn't invent this modeling. Others could tell you how important it is. That's why the whole discussion about reintroduction has been going on. There's another block here in the Glacier Bob Marshall, and there's the Canadian Rockies blocks. And the sinks, the places where animals can get into trouble, are in red. But you can see that it still links up. And you link up right through here on this model, right through the Missoula country. That's where a connection lies, right around this town that we're in here. This is some similar modeling for wolves. Connection, Yellowstone across the Centennials, through the Selway Bitterroot, across this country here, this I-90 corridor, up into the Bob Marshall, through that Waterton Glacier country, through the Crow's Nest Pass, up to the big block in the Canadian Rockies. So we are sitting here pretty close to a pretty important area at a continental scale for wildlife. Now, what can we do about it? Well, this is some modeling by American Wildlands that Rich Walker and Lance Craighead did about least cost path. Where might the animals move? This was done based on elk, cougar, and grizzly bear. Where might they move? And what have they got to move from? Here are the big blocks of land, the Salmon Selway, the Northern Continental Divide, Greater Yellowstone. Here's Missoula right here. Here's 9 Mile Country, and here's Rock Creek. And you can see they could move through there from this model, and in fact, we know that some individuals actually have in the last couple of years. Some individual grizzly bears have crossed in both those places. It's always very validating when models actually show things that work. I'll also talk about this connector up here in the Cabinet Yaak later. But so what's going on in here? Well, there's private land. There's lots of public land. This is roadless areas. This is wilderness. And the blue is private land. What about that? Well, you know, tonight here in the audience here is Seth Wilson, who, as he told it to me, is working one rancher at a time at reducing the conflicts between humans and grizzly bears to try to create enough capacity for the bears to occupy enough range so that they can meet their demographic needs over life. And so working to avoid conflicts, helping ranchers avoid animal conflicts on their places, working with the top-down mechanism of the Endangered Species Act that makes it necessary for ranchers to want to coexist with the grizzly bears, plus the honest impulse of many people that they think it's kind of cool that they have them, working on getting the animals through places like the Rocky Mountain Front or here through, this is a photograph that I took up in the Blackfoot country, in the area where the, just not far from here at all on the road over towards Rogers Pass towards Great Falls. Slowly the animals are moving out of the Mission Mountains, crossing these fields, getting into other mountain ranges, and can recolonize from there. This is Missoula from the air, a shot I took last fall. And what's interesting about it is there's the Rock Creek country here, and you can see there's not that big a gap between A and B. That other photograph was taken just over here. Things can move through there. They're not going to move through Missoula, but they can move around it. And they can also move around it this way. This is just north of Missoula. This is Highway 93. These are the Mission Mountains. There's the rattlesnakes. And this is near the Bison Refuge. The Kootenai Salish people have a highway that runs across their reservation. And when the Department of Highways said, we want to expand it, the Kootenai Salish people said, well, if you bring highway mitigations like they have in Banff. So they actually commissioned somebody to do an environmental impact statement, and they took photographs of the structures in Banff, like the ones I showed you, and said, we want one of those here, we want one of those there, we want one of those here. Mile 12 in Banff, it'll be mile 14 here, and so on. Up the system, and then we're going to go one better. We want to bury the highway in one place so the animals can go right over top of it. And the Department of Transportation agreed. And this is very important at a landscape scale because it connects the Mission Mountains and the Sealy Swan and all that country. It's connected to the Bob Marshall across and makes a possible connection to 9 Mile and across to the Selway Bitterroot. So that's what one group of local landowners did to help make things happen. I-90, why not? We do it on the Trans-Canada Highway in Canada. Why not mitigate the highway? We know how. Now, this is some more modeling we did about how the system might hang together. This is by Troy Merrill and Dave Matson, and this shows where potential grizzly bear source areas would be. Surprise, surprise, the same ones. Yellowstone, Salmon, Selway, Glacier, Bob Marshall, Northern Continental Divide, Canadian Rockies. But they also indicate that the Cabinet Yaak country is extremely important for the connections. And I also know that the Fish and Wildlife Service is thinking hard about this stuff too. This area here in the Cabinet Yaak is a connector that also feeds into this big pool of life north of the border. Well, when you think about it, how far away is that from doability? This is a map of roadless labs I got from Montana Wilderness Association. We have already got a block of protected area here in Glacier. Here's the Bob Marshall Wilderness in orange. Here's the Absaroka Beartooth country and so on. But lime green is roadless land. You start protecting all that roadless land, as at least the rule did that President Clinton promulgated, and you're pretty close. This is the Cabinet Yaak country here. You're getting awfully close if you combine that with highway mitigations along I-90, and you combine that with local landowners who manage to do sanitation issues and start to think about these things. This can happen, just as it's happening north of the line. And we can actually restore the magnificence to this place that Ernest Thompson Seton wrote about 100 years ago. And it doesn't have to happen in a way that causes massive conflict, and it doesn't have to happen in a way that disregards local people, and it doesn't have to happen with UN helicopters and Belgian paratroopers and blue helmets. It's just a matter of living on the land in a cooperative manner and allowing nature to flourish along with people. And that's the essence of what we're talking about with the Yellowstone to Yukon idea. Various people contributing in various ways to doing stuff. Tonight, my colleague Katie Duell is up in Mineral County working with, as part of the RAC, as it's called. I'm learning all the terminology, and that doesn't want to stay in focus. But anyway, talking with folks about how the National Forest Plan and so on might work to think at this scale on linkages. Now, I've talked a lot about the Yellowstone to Yukon region because that was the subject of my talk, and it's a good thing I did. But I want to just share a couple of, I don't know why that's freaking out on me. What's going on? Can you just hold that for me, Lori, so that I can get through? Good news is I only have about 3 more hours to talk. We've been talking about a lot about grizzly bears and some about wolves. This is a map of historic wolf range in North America. There's the wolf color, this khaki color, or khaki as you'd call it. And you can see there's a similar pattern. Here's where they still are in green up in Canada. There are actually none in Toronto. The Fish and Wildlife Service was a little overzealous when they got this far down, but it's pretty close. There's this is the Bob Marshall Glacier. Here's Idaho, Salmon, Selway. There's Yellowstone, looking pretty similar. Colorado is actually a place where they could be reintroduced, and there are now wolves from Yellowstone dispersing down like so. They're just nibbling along the border here. The Appalachians and so on, northern Appalachians and the Adirondacks have identified as an area, and down along the Mexican border and so on. The idea is that we can actually reconnect the whole continent, and in many places, particularly along the mountains, restore flows. This was the idea of the Wildlands Project, with which I was very involved, and many other people have thought about dreaming at scale at how we might restore connectivity and reconnect North America for nature without compromising human success. So we have these broader initiatives in North America, like this what's called sometimes the spine of the continent, which would be to take you from here in Costa Rica, right up Mexico, right up the Skylands and through Colorado and up through Yellowstone to Yukon, right up on into Alaska. The Canadian boreal forest is one of the three wildest forests left on Earth. Goes from literally coast to coast, and the big chunk of it is totally roadless, intact wild country. You can go down the Pacific temperate rainforest coast and reconnect all of that, and you can go up the Appalachians in many places and restore nature. So this is the big dream, and this dream is not just going on in Canada, not just going on in the United States, it's going on all over the world. I got an email from a friend who works on restoring brown bears and ibex and wolves into the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish-French border. He told me with great glee that a wolf had dispersed from the Abruzzi National Park in Italy into the Pyrenees about 3 weeks ago. People are thinking about this in the lower Himalayas. They're working on moving rhinoceros around between reserves, and they have the tigers and they have elephants. Because we're doing this because everybody knows who works on these large mammals that if we want to keep these systems intact, we have to do this. And it's really exciting to think of healing our relationship with nature at this scale. There's one final thing I want to leave you with, and that's one of the great threats that exists to nature, and that's climate change. This is a painting from the Canadian Rockies by an artist named Carl Rungus. Although his style is impressionistic, he was really renowned for his accuracy in his depiction of things. This is the Crowfoot Glacier in Banff Park. You see the fingers of ice that come out like this. This was painted about 1950. Interestingly, Carl Rungus was an artist who literally went from Yellowstone to the Yukon in his painting work. And if you're an art collector and you like wildlife, he's the big guy. This is Michelangelo. Anyway, this is 100 years ago. This is a photograph of the same glacier I took 2 years ago. You can see where the ice used to be on this crow finger, and both toes have dropped off. And my family can remember when it looked like the painting. People I know who are alive, like my dad, could remember that painting as a real life scene. That's how much it's receded. And if anybody tells you that the science is out on climate change, you might think hard in November. As the science is in, and it is really scary. And we can see it happening all through the system. In Colorado, there was some research done on pika colonies, or pika or conies, if I pronounce it right. And the researcher was studying about 23 pika colonies, and 7 of them disappeared. The habitat conditions changed during the study, and the pikas just disappeared off the mountaintops. They had no place to go, just like the plants, just like the grizzly bears in the islands. Climate change can have the same effect as habitat fragmentation. So to respond to that, we need to protect upslope, valley bottom to upslope, so things can migrate because the climate moves upslope. Everybody knows it gets cooler as you go up. And we also need to work north-south, like the Yellowstone to Yukon idea and those other ideas, because plants also migrate and animals migrate latitudinally to adjust to climate. It's colder as you go north. So there are all the more reasons to think in this scale, to think connected, to think big, and frankly to protect a lot more of nature than we've done in the past if we want to have nature in our lives in the future. So I've been talking about big dreams and conservation and protection, and this is and sometimes people say, you environmentalists, and I'll actually call myself an environmentalist instead of just a conservationist, because I think we should reclaim these words. They're not bad words, they're good words. You want everything, you guys. Well, this is North America at night. And all we're talking about is keeping these little blits of black connected. And humanity is doing extremely well in North America, thank you very much. Nature is on the run, not us. And we need to talk openly and honestly about that. And we need to say we want to hang on to these pieces of black so that we might have a night sky where we can see the stars. And we might have other species that are big and wide-ranging in the landscape with us. Because if we crowd them out as we did on the Great Plains, which was a great menagerie, in my great-grandfather's time when he came west, he was on the Great Plains when there were vast buffalo herds and grizzly bears and wolves and elk and pronghorn by the millions. He saw that. I could never see that. Maybe it can be restored in some places, but it was like East Africa, and it's gone. But we still have it in these mountains, and we need to hang on to it because it's a great thing for us to have. And we should never apologize for trying to hang on to that. We need to help people to understand what our challenges are. And we also need to do it because it's just plain the right thing to do. And a question I get asked sometimes is, well, Harvey, you know, you're working on this big vision, these big dreams, but gosh, you know, the roadless rule is under siege. And the Endangered Species Act is under siege. And they're changing the Clean Air Act. And nobody wants to talk about zoning. And boy, you should see this county commissioner. Yeah, that's all true. But we have to dream about what we want to do, not what we want to complain about. And we have to focus on what's possible and set goals and try to realize dreams. Because that's how people created these great places like the Yellowstone and the Selway Bitterroot wilderness areas, and how the endangered species got passed. And that's what motivates people, is a chance to dream in color and to do something where we can look our kids in the eyes and their kids in the eyes and say, we lived at a great crossroads when life was in the balance, at the edge of the 6th great extinction, and we acted and we made a difference. Thank you. Now you have two choices. You can run screaming from the room because I've talked too long, or you can ask me some questions. And if you want to leave without asking questions, I won't be at all unhappy. But usually I would suggest it to me that I allow some questions by Nikki if anybody wanted to ask any.
I hope you don't mind, this isn't a question actually. I'd just like to follow up on something that you said. 3 of our national forests that are in the critical roadless areas that you pointed out are currently revising their forest plans. And now is the time to comment on how important the proposed wilderness and roadless areas are and for wildlife connectivity and for wild places. And the deadline for comments is April the 27th. So everybody can help.
You know, I was asked, just to build on that, I was asked, somebody said, well, what can I do? And this was a talk I gave in Aspen a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about some efforts in Colorado like this. And I said, I think the single most important thing you can do if you want to take an active step as a citizen of the United States is to support the roadless rule. And that single thing protects more habitat that matters than anything else. And it was a promise, as I recall, and I'm a guest in your country, so I will be very cautious in what I say. But I recall a promise that that would be maintained. And at the moment, it is difficult to see how that promise is being kept. But it's there. And it's a really important thing. So yes, by all means. You want to do another?
One more thing is, I don't have the website address. It's the Western Montana Planning Zone, and it's the Lolo, Bitterroot, and Flathead are all together revising their plans.
Yeah. There's another thing I might refer you to on that topic. There's a recent article in Conservation Ecology that came out in January 2003, late 2003, called USDA Forest Service Roadless Areas Potential Biodiversity Conservation Reserves. And it evaluates the contribution of the roadless areas to the protection of biodiversity in the United States by reference to IUCN international standards. And one of the findings is that it moves the land area protected in the United States in IUCN categories 1 through 3, which are wilderness areas, ecological reserves, national parks, and natural monuments, from 4.8% of the U.S. to 8.5%. And that's for all of biodiversity. And it's an extremely important thing. So enough said on that. Any more questions, or is, oh, there you are.
Because this initiative crosses so many like state borders and national borders, it seems like it's pretty large scale. But how important is it that you maintain sort of community-based support and local support, and what steps are you taking to ensure that you have that local support?
Well, as I said tonight, my colleague Katie Duell, who works in the Yellowstone to Yukon office here in Missoula, is working with county commissioners, local businesses, and so on tonight, working on this concept along what they call the, in the part of the Lolo Forest and the Superior and 9 Mile Ranger districts. So it's very important. And, you know, I tried to talk about that with the top-down, bottom-up graphic. There is nothing better than community support to move a conservation issue, assuming you don't have a pig-headed national government. But you can generally move issues best by having both top-down and bottom-up stuff coming together. And a great example from Montana is when the Scapegoat Wilderness was protected, there was a local initiative by people who lived in the area, and then it went through Congress, and it's a wonderful story of exactly that, top-down and bottom-up. I don't subscribe to the theory that in the absence of any local support, you have to run screaming from your conservation goals. Because the conservation goals remain whether or not there is local support. And it is always better to have local support, and it is always better to work hard to get local support. But if you read a newspaper in Kalispell, Montana in 1910, it said, "We don't want no Glacier National Park. We don't want it, we don't need it, we don't want any of that stuff around here." And if you read if you talk to any of the chambers of commerce in Kalispell or Whitefish or their mayors now, they'll say the economic engine of that part of the world is Glacier National Park. So we don't always have to, as conservationists, give a veto away to local issues. And it's very important we remember that, because frankly there would be no big national parks, there would be no large carnivores in the lower 48, especially the really big ones, if we allowed a unanimous opinion to be the only measure in which we can act for conservation. And I know that's heresy, especially for people who come out of theories from the 1990s, but I think it's really important that we talk about that.
I know in Why to Why we talk about land conservation. Can you talk to us about water conservation? In
Sure.
areas?
Somebody asked me to say, we talked a lot about land conservation, what about water conservation? There's a really neat study done that was combined some work from Chris Frisell, who's an aquatics biologist who's done a lot of work in the Swan Valley, together with some of this grizzly bear research I talked about. And it showed, in terms of the best quality aquatic habitats and the highest integrity watersheds in the region, that there was a huge overlap between when you protected the landscape for the terrestrial mammals like grizzly bears with protecting fish. We're in November or so, we'll be able to make public a bunch of watershed aquatic integrity analysis we've done of all the watersheds in the lower 48 in Y2Y that show where the highest quality streams are by reference to whether they have disturbances from roads, whether they have introduced fish, things like that. And it shows happily that there's still a lot of high quality watersheds with integrity. There are clearly some problems. There are a lot of dams in the system. That's a real concern. But there's also a lot of opportunities. And again, as you go into northern Canada, if you look at the exotic fish, there are none. If you come down here, there's a lot. So again, it's sort of this north-south dichotomy that exists. But you know, we need to do all these things at all levels. And the aquatic dimension is as fundamental. The other thing that we've done is we've helped sponsor some research that matched field surveys done in repair of breeding birds and bird surveys with theory whether you could actually detect where the abundance might be using satellite imagery and greenness maps and stuff like that that come off satellite stuff. And there was some work done at Montana State on that by Kingsford Jones and Andy Hansen, and it showed a remarkable correlation between your ability to map by satellite where you think the things might be and where they actually are based on breeding bird surveys in areas where there's enough people on the landscape to do them. It's really quite interesting to see that the really exciting thing is a lot of these models work. So we're actually seeing the stuff validated. Yori.
On that note, Harvey, I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to more about the state of science on connectivity and what we don't know. What sort of information are we still missing? What do we need to learn in order to know how to do these things on the landscape, and how do you move forward in these uncertainties?
Well, it's a bad thing to ask a lawyer what scientists should do, but what the hell, I'll give an answer. I think what we've learned is that more is better, and that we're actually talking about big chunks of land that we need to protect. And as we go forward in that understanding, we're also understanding that we're able to do that in ways that aren't really highly impacting on human goals and desires. I'm not sure that we need a ton more big-scale science to tell us what we need to do. I showed you outputs from a World Wildlife Fund study that cost quite a bit of money that we helped fund. I showed you outputs from a Matson Merrill study that we helped fund. I showed you outputs from the American Wildland study that they funded. And strangely enough, they came up with the same answers using completely different methods. I could have showed you when the Elk Foundation did sit-down work with all the people who were regional biologists who could tell you where the elk ranges are, where the calving areas are, where the winter ranges are for elk. And strangely enough, the correlation between the modeling done by Lance Craighead and Rich Walker and the American Wildland Center for elk was amazing. So what that tells me, and a lot of other people, is we know enough to act. It's time we acted. And we are acting. And we can always know more. But I'm not sure that the issue is one of science. I think the issue is one of behavior. And of course, you can figure out where crossings ought to be a lot better through more study. And you can figure out, be sure that, for example, some of the research Seth has done. If you look into where the animal conflicts are with ranchers, you might move where you calve and stuff like that. So those things are really important. And you can do, Kate Kendall wants to do a study that how many grizzly bears there are in the Bob Marshall glacier area. That'd be a good thing to know. We don't really know. Those would be valuable additions of knowledge. And we need to do a lot more stuff like that. In the Cabinet Yaak, we need to do a lot more work. But at the big scale, we have our answers already, I'd say. And somebody might start throwing darts at me.
I have a question. You mentioned the issue of rancher conflict a couple times, and I just wanted to ask you if you could talk more about what role do you see agricultural land? Where do you think that fits in the wide vision, the grand vision? And has there been any work done not only out of the perspective of ranchers as a place of conflict around large animal habitat, but rather looking at ag land as a kind of ready-made natural habitat for lots of other sizes and types of creatures that also need connected habitat to move?
Oh, yeah.
And sort of on the ground, what kind of work is happening under this, around those issues?
Yeah. Well, if I gave the impression that ranchers were just a source of conflict instead of creating opportunities for conservation, I really spoke badly. And I apologize for that, because it's not. I grew up actually pulling calves at midnight in March. And I showed a 4-H calf in the Calgary Stampede who stood on my foot for 15 minutes. So I have a lot of understanding of what it is to be around cattle, and I actually really enjoyed that lifestyle. So if I gave any kind of other impression, I just apologize right now. I think there's a big synergy between ranchers and people concerned about nature conservation. And I think that we've had an unfortunate split around a lot of that stuff that shouldn't be there. And there's a lot of people in the land trust community working very hard with landowners at a local level to try to preserve spaces that actually can fit into bigger landscape patterns. And there's a lot of ranchers who have made big easement gifts and that make a real difference. So I think there's a lot of hope there. I'm not such a Pollyanna that I would say that there's a resounding chorus of ranchers at every cattle meeting standing up saying, Yellowstone to Yukon, Yellowstone to Yukon, because that wouldn't be the case.
But not only ranchers, but all types of croplands. And I just wondered if there's any examples of partnerships or work actually going on, that you can talk about, maybe beyond the concept of the easements.
Well, I think that something that's going on locally here that a lot of people in this room know more about than I do, but is this whole idea of the Blackfoot Challenge, where the community is trying to work on that landscape north of here to keep it from getting all fragmented and to try to meet social needs and also to meet nature's needs. It's a really good example right out the backyard here, something that I think is very hopeful. Down near Hebgen Lake, near Yellowstone, there's some recent work done where the landowners in the area working with their county government have decided to create some regulations around subdivision and where it can happen and not, and levels and density. Up in where I live, we might even use the zoning word for that, which we actually can say out loud in my country. And I would encourage you to start using it in your country as a word that might make a real difference. But there's cool stuff happening. And lots of people are trying hard to do good things. So I hope that's responsive. Well, everybody looks like, oh, sorry.
roads are a big issue, and a lot of time we're learning a lot about how to deal with roads. The examples in Bend, the overpasses and underpasses, and, but we're still building more roads. And there's one in particular that I'm wondering if you could share some information on it, if you have any. The big highway expansion project from Haines, Alaska, up to where it meets the Alaska Highway again. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. It goes through Kewaunee. And anyway, I drove it recently, and it's huge. It's massive. And it resembles the highway going through Bend. And what was formerly passable is in lots of cases now unpassable or difficult. And I was just wondering, how can we do these things? How can we continue to build roads like this?
That has a very high record of safety and the speed limits that work. And I mean, that's a whole profession that can be extremely proud of what it's accomplished. And then we sort of are, and if you look at it through that lens, and then we come along and say, well, just a minute. It's not about cars and safety only, it's about wildlife. And there are whole efforts going on around that, people talking about it. And we need to talk about it more. It needs to enter more conversations. It needs to enter every highway construction project. I know some people are trying to impact the way highway money is spent in relation to these things. But the way, when you ask the question, how come we do stuff when we know better? Is that some of us know better, and some of us who do know better have a duty to share that with other people in a way they can hear it. Because you can't assume that everybody knows everything that we know. That's one of the most interesting things I've learned in doing public policy work. Is you can never assume that a decision maker knows anything that you know.
Yeah, I figured, it's a big project, $5 billion. When that kind of money gets spent, you would think that there are some planning discussions.
You would, but unless somebody raises it, it won't be dealt with. I can tell you that just from long experience. So, it's part of the work that we have to do as people who sort of have this other view of the world, is to share that and try to get, and I'm optimistic about it. If you think about highway money, okay, there's a word that I've heard that's used in this country called pork, and I wouldn't dare to say that that has anything to do with the political system here. But I understand that people are very happy as congressmen or senators to bring home road projects to their ridings because it creates jobs and work. You can work on wildlife overpasses and wildlife underpasses and Bering highways and create jobs. So there's a natural opportunity for synergy there that adds a layer of concern. And if you go into cities now, you'll see, like Calgary, which is the biggest city in this part of the world, there are big sound berms now, 20 feet high on the side of freeways, and there are bicycle overpasses over the roads and stuff so that kids can cross safely from one district to the other, and those cost a lot of money. And we do those routinely because people understand that it's important to have that quality of life issue dealt with. So I'm very optimistic about this stuff. I just think it's a question of getting the word out. So it's 8:25, and you've been a wonderfully patient audience with me, and thank you very much. I'll leave you with two things. If you want some propaganda on Yellowstone to Yukon, there's some brochures here. And if you are interested and you're a science researcher, there is a Yellowstone to Yukon science grant program that deals with connectivity. So not all questions have been answered, Lori. And lots of researchers here are working on good things. And there's plenty of things we need to know still. Thanks. Thank you for having me. Thanks for a really nice introduction.
Yeah.
It was lovely. Hey, Pat.
Take care of yourself. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. Oh.